Good morning, everyone. Probably everyone could not hear because I was muted. Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Great, awesome. So let me share my screen and finish up the photosynthesis lecture that we stopped at yesterday and move on to respiration. First, couple of reminders. The quiz one is open and is due today by 11:59 p.m. So if you haven't completed it already, please make sure to complete it by 11:59 today on Friday. Uh, quiz 2 opens on January 30th. It's open at midnight tonight. Okay, so technically it's January 30th. Oh, I should probably start recording. Resume recording. Give me a second. There we go. And the quiz 2 is due on Friday, February 5th. So you have a week. It's going to be open for a whole week, and you have a whole week to take the quiz. The quiz materials are the things that you will need to know for quiz are listed in the quiz description. And all of the materials we have gone over already. There will be nothing from even this lecture on the quiz 2. And new participation assignment on photosynthesis is due today. You should be able to see it on in your web courses. So make sure to complete it before 11:59 p.m. tonight. And it is fairly short. I think it's fairly simple. It's simpler than the last one. So most of it is true or false questions. Will not take much time. So please remember to complete it because the participation assignments in total are worth 25% of your grade. All right, back to photosynthesis. So this is the last slide that we discussed yesterday. So I'm just going to remind you that the sun emits a lot of light energy and the light or photons travel in waves. The closer you get to the sun, the higher spectrum of energy you get. You get gamma rays, you get X-rays, you get microwaves, ultraviolet radiation, the visible spectrum, infrared radiation, microwaves, and radio waves. So all of these waves are emitted by the sun, but the portion that reaches the Earth and is kind of gets through the ozone layer in the Earth is ultraviolet radiation, the radiation in the visible spectrum, and infrared radiation. We cannot see infrared radiation and ultraviolet radiation, but we can feel infrared radiation as heat. And ultraviolet radiation, well, one of the things that we can see how it works is when we stay out in the sun and don't wear enough sunscreen, we get burned by it. Okay, we get sunburn. Or if we go out in the early morning, we may not get sunburned, we just may get tan, because in the skin produces a pigment called melanin, and melanin darkens the skin and reduces the damage done by ultraviolet radiation to the skin. But back to the visible spectrum. Visible spectrum is pretty narrow, and it's called visible because it is visible to the human eye. That is very subjective classification of the light, but it is what it is. So plants and other photosynthesizers, they capture the photons in the visible spectrum, and they use this light to produce energy, to produce glucose or sugar molecules. Okay, what is important, what exactly captures that sunlight is the pigment in the chloroplast that is called chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A is the main photosynthetic pigment in plants. So again, photosynthesis happens in an organelle called a chloroplast. And within a chloroplast, there is a whole intricate structure that captures light and uses the energy from the light to produce sugar. So in the chloroplast, there are three types of chlorophylls: chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and well, the third one is not really chlorophyll, but it's the pigment called carotenoid. Carotenoids, plural. So each type of pigment absorbs energy from some wavelength of light and reflects other wavelengths. So let's go over this graph in more detail. On the x-axis, you see the wavelength, or which is also corresponds to color. So wavelength that is 400 nanometers, it is like violet in color. The wavelength that is 500 nanometers, it's kind of blue greenish in color, and so on. So treat you can view the x-axis as just different colors. Technically, it's the wavelength of light measured in nanometers, but that may make it unnecessarily complicated. So just focus on the light, on the color. On the y-axis, you see the relative absorption in percent um, of the chlorophylls and carotenoid of the particular light. So let's follow the green line, chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A absorbs lights in the violet spectrum, absorbs light in the blue spectrum, early in the blue spectrum, but starts reflecting light, or uh, a little a moment here, or a little note here. If a pigment does not absorb light, it reflects it, okay? So if the line drops to lower on the y-axis, it means the light is reflected. The higher the value on the y-axis here, the higher the absorption in the particular light spectrum. So chlorophyll A reflects green light, reflects a little bit of yellow light, and then starts absorbing the orange and the red. Now, chlorophyll B has a very similar reflectance and absorbance pattern, light reflectance and absorbance pattern. It reflects the violet light and it absorbs the blue light and reflects the green, but starts absorbing the yellow, the orange, and the red. Now, the carotenoids, they also absorb light in the blue spectrum, but they reflect part of the light in the green spectrum, yellow spectrum, orange spectrum, and the red spectrum. So because the carotenoids, they reflect the light in the yellow, orange, and red spectrum, we see them as yellow, orange, or green. All the hues in between are seen in carotenoids. So, for instance, carrots, the vegetable carrots is full of carotenoids. And the reason for that is because the cells within the carrots contain a lot of carotenoid, and the carotenoid reflects the light in yellow, orange, and red spectrum. And this is the reason we see them as, well, carrot color, orange. So this is a somewhat a simpler depiction of the leaf that is full of chloroplasts, which are green. And the reason that we see the leaf as green is because out of all of the sunlight, out of all the wavelengths of light that get onto the leaf, most of them are absorbed, and green, yellow to green, is reflected. And this is why we see leaves as green. Our eye captures the reflected light in a particular spectrum. And for leaves, it happens to be green. All right. So the cells that contain chloroplasts within the leaves are located in the mesophyll. And what is mesophyll? Let's imagine that we take this grape leaf and we slice it in half, and we look at the cross section of the slice of the leaf. So we have some epidermis cells, or like skin cells of the plant, skin layer of the plant, and in the middle the middle layer is called the mesophyll layer. So meso means middle, okay? So, and literally middle leaf, it is translated as a middle leaf layer. So you see that the cells can have a bunch of more stuff in there, and these cells contain lots of chloroplasts. So mesophyll cells, they contain between 40 to 200 chloroplasts per cell. Some other important structural peculiarities of the leaves are the stomata, or the singular for stomata is stoma. What is stoma? Stoma is a leaf pore. It's an opening in this leaf skin, quote unquote, through which gases can get in and water and other gases can get out. So leaf is sealed, and only as the gases and gas exchange and water exchange can occur through stomata or leaf pores, and singular for stomata is stoma. So CO2, which is needed for photosynthesis, gets in through these leaf pores. And the byproduct of the photosynthesis is oxygen, and oxygen leaves the leaf, pardon the tautology, through stoma, through this leaf pore. Now you see that the water is also lost, and this is kind of a occupational hazard because the outside air is less saturated with water compared to the inside of the leaf. Water is just going to be simply evaporated. So plants lose water through stomata. However, the plants kind of contain a lot of water in the mesophyll in the leaves. So how does water get in? If the leaves only lose water, how do they get water? And the answer to that is plants get water through the roots, through the soil. So water comes in through the soil into the leaf, but it's lost through stomata. All right, and these funky red or pinkish things here are the vessels inside of the plants, and the vessels are is how the water is delivered to the leaf from below ground, from the roots. Any questions so far? So important bits are the chloroplasts are contained in the mesophyll leaves, and gas exchange and water loss occurs through leaf stomata or the leaf pores. So photosynthesis occurs in two stages, but before I go in there, I'd like to mention that this is a picture of the chloroplasts, and chloroplasts contains these green stacks that are called thylakoids. The thylakoids look green, and this is kind of a cue that this is the location of the chlorophyll A, or the chlorophylls rather. The chlorophyll is contained in the membrane of the thylakoid, these stacks, thylakoids here, okay? So photosynthesis occurs in two stages. There are light reactions and carbon reactions, and carbon reactions are also called the Calvin cycle. This is how the older textbooks have classified it. So during the light reactions, the light energy is captured within the thylakoids and converted to energy. The byproducts of these reactions, so the water is one of the reactants in these light reactions, and water is what is it called? Oxidized. And a byproduct of this reaction is O2, or oxygen gas. Now, because there was oxidation going on during the light reaction, we have energy produced, and we have one new energy molecule produced, which is a NADPH. Don't worry about too much how it's what it stands for, but the point is this NADPH molecule or NADP plus molecule carries two electrons as well as atom of hydrogen to the carbon reactions. So this is a carrier molecule that carries electrons and hydrogen to the carbon reactions. So light reactions occur in thylakoids, and they produce energy that power carbon reactions, and they produce electrons which are carried to the carbon reactions as well. Now, carbon reactions, they occur in stroma, or just this space in between the thylakoids within the chloroplast. Again, all of this thing is a chloroplast, an organelle and within a plant cell. In the carbon reactions, carbon dioxide is a reactant, and the carbon dioxide is reduced to sugar. Okay, so this NADP molecule, NADPH molecule, donates electrons to the carbon in the carbon reactions. It carries energy, so there is enough energy to build, and hydrogen is also carried to the carbon reactions. So this energy is used to build complex sugar molecule, which stores a lot of potential energy in the covalent bonds. Remember, from the smaller components, from CO2 and H ions and hydrogen ions. Are there any questions about that? Is it pretty clear what's going on?
Yes, Professor. Could you go back over the way you know it's a chlorophyll A in the graph?
Here?
No, it was in that page we were just on. You were pointing out a part of the graph that I think it was the thylakoids.
Oh, thylakoids. Well, all of the chlorophyll, I mentioned that all of the chlorophylls are contained here, but chlorophyll A is instrumental in the light reactions. Chlorophyll B is a supplement. It helps, but it's not kind of critical. So chlorophyll A, or all the chlorophylls, are contained in the membrane of the thylakoids, which is these green stacks inside the chloroplast. Did that answer your question, Blaine?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Dr. H, there's a question about the transfer of electrons in the carbon reactions during photosynthesis.
Yeah.
Is that something that's going to be important to know?
The concept of it will be important, might be important. Okay. Yeah. So during the light reaction, the energy is produced and the electrons are produced that power the carbon reactions or Calvin cycle. So this is an important process to separate, to know that the photosynthesis occurs in two stages, or separated into two stages: light reactions, which actually capture the energy of light, and carbon reactions, which synthesize sugar.
Okay, so just to clarify, NADPH goes to the carbon reactions first, or
it's a cycle. Yeah. So let's say it goes there first. The light splits the water molecules, produces oxygen gas as a byproduct, and since O2 is gone, what is left is hydrogen, right? So this hydrogen is picked up by this NADP molecule, and it becomes NADPH, and it carries 2 electrons because oxygen kind of lost these 2 electrons, and it carries the electrons to the carbon reactions. Now, once the carbon reaction is done, once the molecule is synthesized, NADPH becomes NADP plus. So without the 2 electrons and without the hydrogen atom, okay? And it goes back to the light reactions to replenish the electrons and pick up another atom of hydrogen. Now, another thing that returns to the light reaction is ADP, which is ATP without one phosphate group. And it returns to the light reactions for that extra phosphate group that provides all the energy, becomes ATP, and goes back to power carbon reactions. Did that clarify it, Diamond?
Yes.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Moving on. So photosynthesis, in principle, the reactants and the products are the same, but the ways how plants enter the carbon, how photosynthetic pathways occur differs among plants. So there are three photosynthetic pathways, or rather carbon fixation pathways. There is C3 photosynthesis, C4 photosynthesis, and CAM photosynthesis, CAM, all caps. So again, reactants and products are the same. Reactants are always CO2, water, and light energy, and the products are always a glucose molecule and oxygen gas. So each photosynthetic pathway or each carbon fixation pathway has its own advantages and disadvantages depending on the environments the plant is in. In fact, plants evolved their photosynthetic pathways, or rather photosynthetic pathways in plants evolved to adapt to the environmental conditions. Please keep in mind that the conditions around our planet Earth are very diverse. There are deserts, there are very tundras or very cold regions, right? There are like these prairies where it's hot and dry. In deserts, and it's even hotter and drier. And yet there are plants in prairies. There are plants in deserts. We see cacti and Joshua trees in deserts. But it's not quite. It may be counterintuitive because where do they get water? How are they able to exist? How are they able to store this water and produce sugar, which is an expensive process? And the reason for that is through different carbon fixation pathways. So this is a simple scheme of how carbon fixation pathways occur. So the most plants on Earth, they have C3 photosynthesis or C3 photosynthetic pathway. And don't worry too much about what C3, C4, and CAM means. It's basically it stands for the kind of carbon that carries CO2 to the photosynthetic site, to the to the carbon reaction site. So C3 plants do well in cool and moist weather, and these are the most abundant plants around our planet Earth. C4 and CAM plants are adapted to hot and dry weather. An example of a C4 plant is corn or maize. So corn can grow in hot and dry environments, which is the Corn Belt, literally in US. And it does pretty well there because of the adapted photosynthetic pathway. And CAM plants are adapted to desert conditions, and yeah, they do well there. So what are the differences? In C3 plants, CO2 or O2 enters through stomata at any time of the day, basically. And when there is light, right, we focus on the Calvin cycle here. And Calvin cycle is the carbon reactions. So in C3 plants, CO2 enters the mesophyll cell, and the Calvin cycle or carbon reactions occur in the mesophyll cells. Now in C4 plants, which are adapted to the hot and dry environments, what is the risk of the hot and dry environment? There is a risk of losing water. Plants need water, and one of the things that plants need water for is for the light reactions, okay? So plants cannot afford to lose water, and this is why the plants are closing their stomata and conserve water in C4 photosynthesis. And this CO2 binds to some 4-carbon organic molecule, and it's carried away from the mesophyll and into so-called bundle sheath cells. So those are bundle of cells that protect basically the cell from the water loss, and the sugar is synthesized in those bundle sheath cells. But the point of carrying CO2 away from the mesophyll into bundle sheath cell is to conserve water, basically. That's the main point. And the CAM plants, or plants with CAM photosynthetic pathway, they have a bit simpler logic. they keep their stomata closed during the day when it's hot and dry to prevent the water loss. But at night, they open up stomata, they enrich the mesophyll cells with CO2, and then when the sun comes up, they close the stomata, and the Calvin cycle or carbon reactions occur in the mesophyll cell. So the difference between the C3 plants and the chem plants is that C3 plants have their stomata open during the day or night, and chem plants have their stomata open only during the night when it's cool, when there is less risk of losing water through evaporation. Any questions? Feel free to unmute if you have an immediate question during this time when I'm asking about questions, okay?
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering for my notes, like for the C3, C4, and the CAM, those are different types of carbon fixations? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Carbon fixations, and it is equivalent to photosynthetic pathway. So C3 is a photosynthetic pathway, or C3 is a way of carbon fixation. It's different,
Okay.
like similar things.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Professor,
Yeah, go ahead, Madeline.
could you explain what the bundle sheath cell is again?
Right. The bundle sheath cell is literally the bundle of cells inside inside the leaf. So I've shown you what the mesophyll cell looks like here. So the cells in the mesophyll are look like this. Okay, they're all of the cells that are in the middle of the leaf's cross section. Now, bundle sheath cells are, well, it's not the C3 plant, it's a C3 plant here. But in C4 plant, you see the circle of cells around the vessel of the plant. In the C4 plant, the circle has much more layers to it, and it's called the bundle sheath cell. So it's hard to visualize here, but try to imagine like more protections, more stacked cells around the water vessel here, or not vessel, yeah, vessel, plant vessel. Okay, and those are bundle sheath cells. So let's say CO2 enters here into the mesophyll, but instead of going into the mesophyll directly for the carbon reactions, to the mesophyll cells directly for the carbon reactions, it is bound to a molecule, and this molecule carries the CO2 to here. So instead of going to the first cell that is available, it is carried to very specific cells that are called the bundle sheath cells, which typically surround the water vessels in the plant. Did that answer the question, Madeline?
Yeah, it did. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Okay. So, since I am going to talk about respiration next, I wanted to mention one more thing. Going back to the carbon reactions, the product of the carbon reactions is sugar. Now, plants, they create this sugar, but remember that the energy that the cells can use is not sugar, it's ATP. So despite that the plants create this sugar energy, to use it, the sugar has to be transformed in some way to form ATP. And can anybody guess what happens, where that sugar is traveling after it's synthesized to power other reactions in the plant?
This is just a guess, but is it the mitochondria?
Excellent, Madeline. That's exactly what happens. So after the sugar is produced, it is transported into the mitochondria where lots of ATP is created. And that's what I'm going to talk next. Not for plants, but what happens in the mitochondria. So the topic, I'm continuing with the lecture. The second part of the lecture will be dedicated to respiration. And this picture kind of summarizes what happens in energy-wise in the plants, and well, so photosynthesis makes sugar, and cellular respiration breaks it. Apart from plants, I mean, all organisms respire. All organisms produce respiration because that's how they get their energy, or rather, that's how they convert the sugar into ATP. So plants make their own food, but animals such as bluebird, pictured here, and us humans eat food, which gives us and them the energy they need. And most organisms also require oxygen, which is required in cellular respiration. Now, oxygen is, well, technically, oxygen is not required to get the energy because there is a process that breaks down sugar and produces energy, but does not require oxygen. That is called anaerobic respiration. And I'll go over the simple process that does not yield a lot of energy but does not require oxygen. But most of the energy, like oxygen, helps getting a lot of energy out of sugar. Okay. So cellular respiration, to reiterate, cellular respiration is the process that makes ATP from glucose. Or if glucose is not available, there are other pathways that convert proteins and fats into ATP as well. They're more intricate, but sugar is the preferable reactant to produce ATP. So all organisms, from trees to whales to bacteria, use some form of cellular respiration to make ATP. And this potential energy that in the glucose molecule is when this bond is broken, this potential energy is transferred to this phosphate, oxygen to phosphate bond in ATP molecule. So ATP is the form of energy cells can use. I'm not tired of repeating that because it's very important. I mean, technically we think of sugar as the energy source, but really ATP is the form of energy that is usable by the cells. We can eat sugar and say, oh, I got an energy rush, but no, you didn't get an energy rush. You got an ATP rush from sugar. So ATP is essential because it powers nearly every cellular activity that uses energy. Cells use ATP to do work such as active transport and muscle contractions and virtually everything inside the body and power chemical reactions. So try holding your breath for a minute or two and you will feel weak. And that's because in respiration, we need oxygen for respiration. And without oxygen, there's not enough energy produced in our cells converted from glucose. There's not enough ATP converted from glucose to power our reactions. So we immediately feel weak. If we hold our breath for too long, we will pass out. And this is because there's not enough energy to keep the reactions in our body going. So CO2 is not needed by our bodies, and that's why we exhale it. So inhale oxygen and exhale CO2. And in the next slide, I'll go over it in more detail. So aerobic cellular respiration, aerobic means in the presence of oxygen, is a series of chemical reactions. This is the chemical formula summary of the reaction, and it's basically the reverse of the photosynthesis. Almost the reverse of the photosynthesis. So sugar, glucose, and oxygen are reacting with each other, producing CO2 or carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of ATP. So what happens in our body? Let's look at something a relatable example instead of a bacteria or a single cell. So we inhale O2, we inhale oxygen. Oxygen travels to lungs and distributed around the body with the blood flow, and blood delivers oxygen to lots of cells in our body. Okay, so now the cells have oxygen to power respiration. Within cells, sugar goes into reaction with oxygen and produces CO2, water, and energy. Energy is used up to, for instance, power our muscles when we go on a run, or keep breathing to get that oxygen and to power other reactions. CO2 is produced as a byproduct of the respiration. Okay, CO2 is not needed by cells. In fact, it's toxic to cells if in too high concentration. And that's why blood that has just delivered oxygen into the cell, to the cells, it picks up CO2 and transfers it back to the lungs. And in the lungs, it accumulates and we exhale it. So we inhale CO2, exhale CO2 because we don't need it. We don't use it we don't photosynthesize. So what's the point in keeping CO2? Any questions about that so far? Okay. Now to the slightly complicated part. Cellular respiration includes three main pathways. And in our bodies, it's the basically coupled pathways, like one flows into the other. So the first step in cellular respiration is glycolysis. And during glycolysis, a molecule of glucose or sugar is split in half, forming two molecules of pyruvate. So glucose has 6 carbons and pyruvate has 3 carbons. So here's our glucose, and here are 2 pyruvates. So during the split, some energy is produced, and I'm going to jump ahead and say that it's very little energy. That's not much energy at all. And 2 electrons and hydrogen is donated to this NADH molecule. So this glycolysis occurs in cytosol. And cytosol, so we're not in mitochondria yet, okay? Glycolysis occurs in the cytosol, the liquid part of the cytoplasm. So remember, like, imagine if we hold our breaths, we will feel weak, but this glycolysis is still going to occur because glycolysis does not need oxygen. But because glycolysis produces so little ATP, it produces like 2 molecules of ATP. It is not enough to keep our body going. Okay, so that's why we need oxygen. Now, the second step in respiration.
Excuse me?
Go ahead.
Isn't glycolysis also is part of the first step of anaerobic
That's
cellular
true.
respiration? Yeah. Oh, okay. I was gonna say
That's
that
true.
seems very familiar.
Yeah. So in fermentation, if you've ever done some, I don't know, beer production or winemaking, if you lived in a winery or something.
Yeah, because I've obviously done that.
Well, I hope you're over 21. So if you restrict oxygen to the cells, like if you put some microorganisms to the substrate, they will consume glucose and they will degrade glucose. And they will not need oxygen for that. There will be some byproducts, and one of the byproducts is ethanol. So this kind of process is called fermentation. When glucose is consumed, as some energy is produced, some CO2 is produced, which gives the gassiness to the beer, for instance. And the benefit of that is ethanol, which gets us high. All right. So the second step, I'm going to go back to the second step in the cellular respiration is the Krebs cycle. So a derivative of the glucose, the pyruvate, is oxidized and CO2 is released and picked up by, if we're talking about the body, it's picked up by the blood and carried away. More energy is transferred to electrons during the Krebs cycle. And now the final step is electron transport chain. Now, electron transport chain is the only step in the cellular respiration that requires oxygen. Okay? So all of the electrons picked up by NADH and FADH2 is another electron and hydrogen carrying molecules. They transport all of that good stuff to electron transport chain. And in the electron transport chain, remember, the electrons jump from protein to protein to protein to protein, releasing energy during each jump. And this is the part that produces the most ATP. This is the part that produces the most energy. And we have 10 minutes left, so I might skip a couple of slides to show you exactly how much energy is yielded by glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. And during the electron transport chain, the water is produced. So oxygen goes in, all the hydrogen is carried to the electron transport chain, and as a result, we get energy and we get H2O or water. So a reminder, where does cellular respiration take place? Glycolysis always occurs in cytosol, the liquid part of the cytoplasm. It does not occur in mitochondria. What if the plant cell is prokaryotic and not eukaryotic? Because we in our bodies, all of the cells are eukaryotic. We have true nucleus in our cells. In prokaryotes, they still have the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, but the Krebs cycle takes place in the cytosol, and electron transport chain is found in the cell membrane. So in the eukaryotic cells, the electron transport chain is located in the membrane of the mitochondria, not the overall cell membrane, but in the cell membrane of the mitochondria. But in prokaryotes, there's no mitochondria, so their electron transport chain is located in their cell membrane. And eukaryotic cells, or cells with true nucleus, contain mitochondria or specialized, the powerhouse of the cell, or specialized organelles where the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain are located. So glycolysis in the cytosol and Krebs cycle and electron transport chain reactions in the mitochondria if the cell is eukaryotic. And mitochondria produce the most ATP. Okay, so and in eukaryotic cells, obviously, because prokaryotic may not have them or do not have them. So aerobic cellular respiration taps much of the potential energy stored in glucose, and the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, which occur inside the mitochondria in eukaryotic cells, are the key ATP generating process. You know what, I'm gonna skip a couple of slides to that energy budget because this may not be as useful for understanding what's going on at this level of detail than just seeing the numbers. So aerobic respiration yields 36 ATP, 36 molecules of ATP. Let's look at glycolysis first. Glycolysis yields 2 ATP molecules. The Krebs cycle yields 2 ATP molecules. And the electron transport chain yields 34 ATP molecules. So you can appreciate the magnitude of energy that is generated by the electron transport chain compared to just glycolysis or Krebs cycle. So essentially, if I go back to my old example of holding the breath, we do not get oxygen, which is required for electron transport chain. Oxygen is not required for glycolysis. Oxygen is not required for the Krebs cycle. So if we hold our breath, we still will get our measly 4 molecules of ATP, which is not nearly enough to sustain our energy needs. So what we do need is the functioning of the electron transport chain, which needs 6 molecules of O2 to go. Now, some of the total, if you tally up the molecules of ATP, you will get 38 ATP, but some of the energy is required to transport all the molecules that hold electrons and hydrogen. So 2 ATP is required for that, and the net grand total for the ATP yield is 36. All right, so this is kind of the message that I wanted to drive home here. And I wanted to explain the differences between glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. And the slides that I skipped over, they might be going too deep into the mechanisms, which for the introductory biology class is not necessary. I am going to leave them in the slides, but I'm not going to test you on them. So if you're interested, you're very welcome to ask me questions about them, and you're very welcome to schedule office hours and talk to me about them. But I'm not going to put them on a test. In the couple of minutes that I have left, I am going to mention, we kind of mentioned this already, but cellular respiration is not always aerobic, like in production of alcohol, wines and ciders and what have you. The oxygen is not needed, and what is going on, how respiration occurs, is glucose is split by glycolysis into two pyruvate molecules, and some CO2 is producing bubbles, for instance, in champagne. And the other product of the pyruvate split is the ethanol, and the ethanol is basically alcohol that is safe to drink in moderation, of course. The other anaerobic way of respiration is lactic acid fermentation. So during glycolysis, we know that glucose molecule splits into two pyruvate molecules, producing 2 ATP. But then and another product would be, there's some energy reactions would go on here, and the end product would be lactic acid or lactate. So if we think of going to the gym and doing like powerlifting or just working with the weights, and you will notice that if you don't breathe, or even if you do breathe, your muscles get tired very, very, very fast. And this is because in the muscles, the pathway, the electronic transport chain is essentially switched off because there's no oxygen. The oxygen is depleted. You're not breathing fast enough to power the muscle work, and you will feel that muscles are tiring, okay? And this is because the aerobic respiration switches to lactic acid fermentation, and lactic acid can accumulate in the muscles. And there is a wide misconception that accumulation of lactic acid causes muscle soreness on the next day. And this is not true, okay? What causes muscle soreness is the micro tears in the muscle. When you're exercising your muscles, to how the muscle grows is it first tears a little bit, and then those tears are regenerated and producing more muscles, okay? And so what hurts the next day and the day after are those micro tears in the muscles, and not actually the lactic acid. So that, I thought that was interesting to mention. I'm not gonna go into, well, this is just more detailed slides. But that's all I wanted to cover for today. And we have 2 minutes for questions and clarification. So feel free to shoot your questions.
I don't have a question, but I did send you a message that I was having trouble watching the supplementary videos. I didn't tell you in the original message, but I'd already tried it on Google Chrome, Internet Explorer, and Firefox, and all of them just give me infinite loading.
It works fine for me. I frankly don't know what's going on. Does anybody else have this problem? Because there are public videos. There shouldn't be like any problems with that.
Oh my gosh. I hate when I'm the only one with a tech problem.
So Blaine says no. Lauren says she doesn't have a problem.
Yeah, I took the quiz without watching the supplementary videos, and I got most of it right, but like it would have made it easier.
Might be something wrong with your computer. And somebody suggests, so John suggests try it on your phone. Have you tried it on your phone?
I'll do that.
Yeah, there might be a bug on your computer that prevents like something. So yeah, try another medium.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Anybody else has questions?
Could you go back to the ATP diagram and just explain that like one more time about how like it's increasing the ATPs? Yes, that slide.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there are 3 steps in aerobic respiration, the anaerobic part and the actual aerobic part. So the first step is glycolysis that occurs in the cytosol. Glycolysis breaks the glucose molecules into 2 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate. This process produces, 2 molecules of ATP and 2 molecules of NADH, which carries electron and hydrogen. Now there's some transition step, which creates 2 molecules of acetyl coenzyme A. Not important. But the important part is the Krebs cycle, which produces another 2 molecules of ATP and gives out some more electrons electrons and hydrogens to the carrier molecules. Now, in the 3rd step, all of the hydrogens and all of the electrons are funneled into the electron transport chain, which also needs oxygen to function. And the electron transport chain, the electrons jump from one protein to another protein to another protein to another protein. We covered it last time. Yeah, I think we covered it during last class. And as the electrons jump from one protein to the next, some energy is released, and this energy is ATP. So virtually like 34 molecules of ATP is released as a result of the electron transport chain. So 2 molecules released in glycolysis, 2 molecules released in Krebs cycle, 34 released during ATP. The sum is 38, but 2 molecules of ATP is needed for transport of hydrogen and electrons to the electron transport chain, which yields the total of 36 ATP molecules of ATP in aerobic respiration. Was that helpful, Lauren?
Yes, that was very helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, guys, it's 10:22. The class is over. If you have additional questions, please schedule an appointment with me or Ansley during office hours. We are sad and bored during our office hours and would be happy to talk to you about the material and things that are unclear, okay? So have a good one, and I'll see you on Monday.